So who am I, in case anyone was wondering? So I'm Neil, and I've had a lifelong love of fish and fishing, which is kind of what brought me to this industry. I actually started my career in the world of advertising, but soon realised that city life wasn't going to be for me, and returned to education at Sparshot College in my mid-20s. As Sophie said, I was then very fortunate to spend 7 years as the river keeper for Montesson Abbey on the River Test, working for the National Trust. And for the last 4 years, I've been working as part of the Habitats team at the Wessex Rivers Trust. My day-to-day job is identifying, designing, planning, and delivering projects to improve the health of chalk streams in the Wessex area. And I think tonight's talk should be a really good insight into the kind of finished product of what we do. So, what are we going to talk about this evening? I'm going to start hopefully pretty briefly with looking at what the difference between enhancement and restoration of rivers is. It's kind of semantics, but we ummed and ahed about the what we should call tonight's talk, and eventually decided on enhancement over restoration. I just wanted to briefly explain why. We'll then look at the kind of bigger picture of what makes a river healthy and what makes a great chalk stream habitat. And then we'll look at how we go about creating that. And that'll just be through, I've got 8 or 9 examples of projects that myself and the team have done over the last 4 years. And we'll look at before photos and after photos and some during photos and talk about how and why and what we're doing, basically. So this question of enhancement or restoration, like I say, it's kind of semantics, but one of the questions that gets thrown at us from time to time, especially on the chalk stream, is if it's restoration that you're doing, what exactly you're restoring it to? And the reason that people kind of ask this question is that because chalk streams, as we know them, are more or less, man-made in many ways, and they're intensely managed systems. So the idea of what you're then restoring it to becomes pretty tricky, because there really isn't, kind of a blueprint for what it should be in many ways. Over the years, whether it was, and we're talking over hundreds of years, whether it was for water meadows, mills, or more recently things like land drainage and farming, these rivers have been manipulated by man for our usage. So instead of saying we're restoring habitat, really what we're doing is enhancing what's there. The processes that man has or the manipulation of man over the years has kind of limited or removed natural processes in a lot of areas of the chalk streams, and it's allowing and restoring those natural processes is really what we're doing. And we'll go more into what those processes are and how we do that as we go along. Really what we're doing is making chalk streams better for the things that live there. And essentially, to me, it doesn't really matter what we call it, so long as we're doing it. So let's look at the kind of bigger picture of what makes a healthy river. And I won't claim to have made this analogy myself, but we've got this analogy of the three-legged bar stool, and you'll all be familiar with sitting on a three-legged bar stool. If one leg is out of whack, then the whole thing becomes pretty wobbly. We've got water quality, flow, and habitat are kind of our 3 legs of the bar stool. They all come under pressure from different things. So, for example, we've got flow, which is affected by things like abstraction, climate change, so that affects the amount of river in the water. We've got water quality, which comes under pressure from sewage, road runoff, fertilizers, pesticides, sediment. That's by no means an exhaustive list of all the things that end up in the water that affect water quality. And then when it comes to habitat, it's all the things that we as people have done over the years: straightening, tidying, dredging, over management. And again, that's not an exhaustive list. We'll look at more as we go through the examples. On the left-hand side here, the water quality and flow, these are really kind of national and global issues that are really only going to be solved kind of at government level through legislation. For example, climate change, obviously we know that's a global problem that's going to need legislation sorted out. Again, with the sewage and the road runoff, ensuring that those aren't the problem that they currently are, is something that as people on the ground we can campaign for, and we can put pressure on, and we should be and are, but they're not things that we can have a direct local effect on. Whereas habitat really is where we can get involved. And whether it's undoing things that have been done in the past or doing more things to help that habitat is something that a local level, whether that's ourselves as a Rivers Trust or as the people as landowners or community groups, can really have an effect on. And I can understand when people say, what's the point of thinking about habitat when actually you've got these other huge issues over here? And really what good habitat does is it builds resilience. It allows the river to cope better with all of these other pressures that are on it. And it means that, when eventually, fingers crossed, that these larger problems do get sorted, there's something still there to save. And that in the meantime, as I hope the examples show today, we can really make a huge difference to the health of individual stretches of river. So what makes great chalk stream habitat? There is no single answer to this. Like there's lots and lots of things that make great chalk stream habitat, and really it's those lots and lots of things that are key. And if there's one word that we keep coming back to, it's throughout this talk, it will be diversity of habitat, and it's the habitat features that provide this diversity. So, what do we mean by habitat features? It's all the things that are in and around and on and under the river. We need shade, we need sunlight, we need overhanging cover, we need woody features in the river, we need variations in flow, we need silt in the right places, and we'll talk about silt plenty as we go on. We need areas of gravel, we need submerged cover, we need I've already said variations in flow, floodplain connectivity, marginal plants. So you can see that there's lots and lots that go into making good chalk stream habitat, and we'll talk about why all these things are important when we look at some of our examples. But I just wanted to get across that there's lots of things that go into making great habitat. And the reason that this diversity is so important is the nice little phrase, species have niches. All of the different species, whether it's birds, insects, mammals, or fish that live in and around the river, they all rely on often overlapping but often very different niches within the river. And my favorite kind of visual example of this is the humble case caddis, because, I mean, for those of you who don't know, a case caddis is an aquatic insect that then eventually hatches out into a caddisfly or a sedge if you're into your fishing. The reason I like this as a visual example of this is that they wear their niche on the outside, so we can tell what their niche is from the case that they build around themselves for protection. So I apologise for not knowing the individual subspecies of each of these caddis, but you've got up the top here and down the bottom. We know what their niche is. They live in the ranunculus, the water crow's foot that's in the river, and so we know that if we don't have a river that's suitable for ranunculus, we're not going to have this particular species. Similarly, we've got this chap here who's coated himself in relatively large pieces of gravel. So we know we need a gravelly bed for him to be there. Similarly, this guy here, smaller piece of gravel, almost sand, grit. So we know that we need finer sediment elsewhere in the river channel. And then this one, to me, looks more like decaying plant matter. Perhaps that's a more marginal species where that kind of matter is going to settle. More than just each species has a niche. Those niches are constantly changing as well. So you've got different life stages. If we think about a single species, so if we think about a trout, for example, the kind of habitat niche that a trout fry will need is very different to an adult trout. For example, your fry, his main concern is just not getting eaten. So perhaps he wants to be in the overhanging cover and the willow that's growing out of the river where he's going to get some safety. Once he's older, his main concern is feeding and conserving energy. So maybe we're going to find him in a deeper hole down here, a deeper pool down here at some point. And of course, those niches change throughout times of year as well. So you can imagine, again, if we think about a trout, that during a winter flood, for example, they need sanctuary. So they need somewhere out of the flow that they're going to be able to cope. Whereas in a summer drought, they're going to need to be in some deeper, cooler water, perhaps with overhanging cover, some shade. So Niches and diversity are extremely important to supporting all of the life that lives in the river, and largely that's what we're looking to create or enhance when we're doing our work. Largely what we're doing in our work is undoing historic damage or mismanagement. And it's important to kind of think like that. Actually, when we say damage, we often don't mean kind of malicious damage. Uses of the river and the land surrounding the river and people's knowledge and attitudes towards the river have changed dramatically over the years. And when we look at before photos, none of these are pointing the finger and saying, this is bad, why has someone done this? It's merely a changing of attitudes or a changing of usage towards what people want out of the river and what we understand as good habitat. And what we're doing through this work is allowing and encouraging natural processes to create the habitat diversity that we've been talking about. So what we're trying to do is put the river into a state where essentially it looks after itself. We want to be able for people to reduce management of the river themselves and for essentially the river to do its thing. I think hopefully through examples we'll see that. First example, and just so no one, in case anyone's wondering, I'm not going to share exactly where any of these are as we go along. In fact, there's one at the end that is fairly obvious where it is, so I don't mind that. But a lot of the estates and places that we work with are not always that keen on publicity. So we've got, and I think the other thing to say as well is that there's always good and bad in all of the before photos. So if we have a look at this piece of river here, the first thing for me that I notice as an issue is how straight it is. And actually it's this straight for about 100 yards further back upstream as well. River's flowing this way, that's upstream. So you've got some good stuff here in that we've got some fairly lush marginal growth. That's not a bad thing. There's going to be a fair amount of diversity in terms of the plant species. We've got some good overhanging cover here. However, the straightness means that actually you've got very uniform flow, and the width of the river means that you've got very quite slow flow. And you can actually see in the gravel here that it's not clean. Even where there's not visible lots of silt on the bottom, like these darker areas, you've got kind of, looks almost like sand or silt over the top of the gravel. So what's the solution? Now, before I go on to the solution, the other issue you've got here is that we've got kind of very almost homogeneous overhanging cover. So there's not very much diversity between the shade and the light that's on the channel. So what's the solution here? So we know we need to increase some sinuosity because we've got a very straight channel, and that will be a recurring theme throughout a lot of what we look at today. And we know that the channel needs to be a bit narrower to improve the flows. So what did we do? So this is the project, or this little piece of what was quite a large project following completion. This is literally the day after we finished. You can see that on the bank, which has a path on it, we've built what we call a berm. And this berm is built from floodplain gravels. The landowner was happy for us to dig them a pond adjacent to the river where the gravels came from and topped with floodplain soil and turf so that you get back all that lovely natural marginal growth at the end. And on the other bank, we've done what's called hinging these willows into the river. And by hinging, what I mean is you can just about see here, we've cut through this willow, but we haven't cut through it entirely. And because it's willow, and as you'll probably be aware, willow grows like absolute stink, it will stay alive, which is really important because it means that these features will continue to grow. Now, as you can imagine, in amongst all of these branches, there's still ability for fry to get in there for cover. It's going to capture silt in amongst the branches, which is great for those invertebrate species that rely on silt, good for plant growth in it as well. So we're creating essentially living berms out of these hinged trees. Now, what does this look like a year later? All grown up, which is lovely. And you can see that the plant community within the river, now that we've improved that flow, has completely changed. What was 2 slides ago almost entirely parsnip with the occasional starworts, is now virtual ranunculus. And there was a hell of a lot more. I turned up about 2 hours later than I should have done because the river keepers were doing weed cut at the time. So there was a lot more weed than this before then. And you can see the willow is living, is growing. We've got now a nice balance between the amount of light on the channel and still got some darker, shadier areas. Now we've got the sinuosity. The flow will gradually mean that the far bank where you're pushing water into is going to become slightly deeper. Sediment will deposit on the inside of the margins, make that slightly shallower. So we've got variation in depth there now as well. And as you can see, the floodplain gravels and the floodplain turfs that we put on here grow up extremely quickly. So we've got this lovely, lush marginal growth. Another stretch of river. Again, it's not all negative. There's a decent amount of weed in the river here. We've actually got a reasonable shade to sunlight ratio. There's a tree over here in the distance that the landowner has not removed, which is fantastic. But what you'll notice here is we've got this riffle starts here, and that's actually because there's a rock weir there. I'm not sure of its purpose, but you can see that above the weir here, the water becomes very laminar, very flat. And again, we've got a very straight bank. And what's not apparent to the naked eye, that this bank here is entirely made of concrete sandbags. So you get a very sheer marginal edge here that essentially just goes straight down for a meter. And what that means is that you completely limit the diversity of marginal plants that you get. Essentially, you've got in-channel plants here, and you've got terrestrial plants, grasses, etc., that will grow up here. What you miss out on is all the emergent species that would otherwise grow. As you can actually see over here, where you've got slightly more, you've got reeds and rushes, and there's watercress in the margins that are more diverse. And initially there was another row of these concrete sandbags lining this bank over here. So what was the solution here? Again, looks pretty raw because this is the immediate after effect. What we did was, again, we dug floodplain gravels from some nearby woodland. We removed sandbags, and instead we built what we call a gently sloping marginal toe down into the river. So that gives the ability for that diverse array of marginal plants that we'd like to see. We removed the weir, and we'll actually go into more detail with that in a minute, so I won't talk too much about that. This large willow here, you just about see what we've done is we actually did what we call root balling it, where we severed some of the roots, pushed it over, so we're creating that real low overhead cover that fish can take refuge under. And we've also put in these two large woody features. One of the natural processes that is missing from a lot of the chalk streams is trees in the river. If you think about naturally in nature, trees fall over all the time. And for the sake of tidiness, or sometimes there's good practical reason to do it, but often for the sake of tidiness, we pull them out. And I'll be able to show you shortly like the effect of having these large pieces of wood in the river. So what did this one look like a year later? In fact, this was this summer. So that was 2023 was when the project was done. And this is 7 months later. You can see already that we've got more diverse margins growing up, but you can't really see from this photo what's going on in the river, partly because the margins have grown up so well. So we get the drone out, and this is where you can start to see some really interesting things happening because of these large pieces of wood in the river. You can see this piece of wood is actually pushing water. It goes up in an arc, and that's pushing water underneath as well as around. What it did initially was it created this hole here, but then other bits have got stuck on it, and weeds grown out of it and under it and stuck on it as well. And actually, there's now fairly slack behind, but you've got all this wonderful area that fry can hide in, and find some refuge and some cover. And instead, water's been going around the outside, which has dug this lovely pool here. Again, maybe it's better habitat for a larger fish later in its life. The other really lovely thing about what's happened here is that it's kicked up all of this gravel, which is going to be loose. And because we've got good flow over here, you've got some nice loose gravels. could potentially be fantastic spawning habitat for a trout. So this one log has created habitat, for large adult fish, for spawning fish, for fry, all on its own. And you've got similar things that you can't quite see going on up here, where this log has also scoured itself out a nice pool. And of course, we've got our lovely overhead cover providing some shade and some sanctuary to fish up here. Now, I mentioned a moment ago about the effects of taking the weir out and what we did there. So this is a before photo again, and for reference, the weir is literally under these trees that are handily positioned, so we can't see it. So we took the weir out. This is again immediately post completion of the project. What we did was we put in a series of trees. There was some willows here that we cut down and put into here, and then felled some alders on top. This large willow here actually came from the opposite bank here, and we winched it across. And then this one is hinged in down here. And you'll notice we've left these trees that are providing some really nice low overhead cover. This one, there's actually another one behind this tree here. So making sure that we're still maintaining that kind of shade to light ratio. But what we've done is, through these trees, is give the river some kind of light meander. So, it's coming through here underneath this, right across the channel tree, round and then down here and then off round here and into the section that we just looked at. So again, we've created that diversity of flow that's having some really interesting effects. If we just zoom in slightly on this one, we can see that again, the flow has gone, the riverbed has gone from being relatively flat and homogeneous to having these lumps and bumps. You've got a lovely pool forming here under this bush, and this gravel margin will eventually, now that it's relatively shallow, these marginal plants that we put into the margin here will grow out into this silt that's now depositing here, and eventually colonize some of this and create another area of diverse habitat. This is a couple of weeks ago, looking at that same stretch from above, putting this meander into the river and getting that diversity of habitat that we were talking about earlier. This is the area slightly upstream, so that's the bridge at the top there. And again, this area here, you can see silt depositing on it already, where we've pinched the stream down here, creating this slack that silt will deposit into. Fantastic habitat for our invertebrates that rely on silt for some or all of their life cycles. Again, lots of interstitial spaces within these woody features for fry to hide, and also lots of clear areas where you're going to get in the future better weed growth than they've seen in the past. I couldn't find the before photo for this one, but of course we're looking at the removal of a weir. This one is an old mill house, and this is the weir that was used for the mill. It would be nice to have a photo that looks straight upstream here, because you'd be able to see how kind of dead straight and homogeneous that channel was before. But the important things to notice here really are the water level behind the weir, and also the amount of silt down here. I remember doing the water vole survey for this particular reach, and I was wading in, somewhere up here, and I was up to my chest in water and up to my knees in silt. And that's because that natural process of sediment transport down the river has been interrupted. So instead of moving downstream and settling in the margins or in behind obstructions and things like that you'd expect in a river, and eventually washing all the way downstream, it's trapped. And that silt's not a bad thing, but when it's everywhere within a reach, it's a sign that something's not right. And obviously what was not right here is the weir. So how did this one turn out, and what did we do? So once we removed the weir, eventually it looked like this. So what we did was, once the weir was removed, we used a series of what we call woody berms. And you can see one in the foreground down here, which is essentially tightly packed brushwood. Was taken from adjacent hazel coppice and other trees that were on the riverbank. It's then held tightly in place by cross beams that are staked into the riverbed. And that is what we've used along here to give the reach some sinuosity. And again, with that sinuosity, what you're getting is deeper areas on the outside of bends, shallower areas on the inside of bends. We also installed several gravel riffles, which ensure that water is held up slightly. So you've got these slightly deeper, slower areas behind the riffles, and then these fast runs through clean gravel as it travels downstream. And these woody berms, you'll see some more examples later. What the idea is that they trap silt and sediment within them. We then transpose plants from elsewhere on the reach into the woody berms, and those over time will colonize them. And you can see how well this is another project from last winter that you can see just how well everything is recovering relatively quickly. So this is another stretch that, as you can instantly see, is long and straight. This one actually, at some point in history, I believe, had some watercress beds off to the side of it, and the estate had already started doing, quite some years ago, had essentially remade the bank along here from actually from faggots and woody material behind, which had really helped to some extent with narrowing the river down. But it was still quite dramatically wide for the amount of water that this reach sees. So you've a very, very uniform flat bed. And I mean, at the time that I took this photo, you could probably walk in wellies down most of it. It was that kind of shallow and uniform. This is what we ended up doing here. This is again immediately after installation. We actually did something that we very rarely do on these projects. I was talking earlier about letting the river do its own thing and just putting it in a position where natural processes can occur. What we found here, or what we felt here, was that if we were expecting the river to loosen the gravels and create holes through areas of high velocity, the bed had been the way it was for so long and it was so compacted that wasn't really going to happen there, however much sinuosity or however large the woody features that we put in were. So we actually took the step here of digging those with an excavator and using the gravel spoil from the riverbed to create parts of the meander. As you can see, you've got the gravel here, and then further downstream as well. And we'll look at some of those features individually. But we had to be very kind of clever with the way we did that and try and ensure that we were putting these holes in, or pools in, areas where they would naturally form. Because if you don't do that, then what happens is that the flow over the pool isn't good enough and it will, in time, silt up. And that's not what we want. So let's look at some of these individual features that we put in. And we've used a whole range of techniques through here, depending on what material was available to us. So this meander that we put in on this side here is, as you can see, there's a lot of, as you find up and down the chalk streams, sadly, lots of dead ash trees. We were able to fell quite a number of those and bring them into the river to create this meander here. And you can see already that they're catching this silt here. This is one of the pools that we dug. As you can see, it's not particularly deep, but enough to give that variation in depth that's going to provide a degree of diversity to the depths that we've got. By putting it adjacent to this berm, you're ensuring that the water speed over and up is good enough that it's not going to silt up. Similarly here, just downstream of this berm again, where we're concentrating this flow, there's a pool in this area here. And you can see as well, using very large woody features to really direct that flow. And you of course going to catch lots of silt in behind this, so that will help these marginal plants grow out and solidify the new shape channel as it goes on. In the margin here, we've used the gravel to make part of this, but also another woody berm, this time with willow, which will regrow, so eventually providing some overhead cover as well. Down at the lower end of that stretch, we dug probably the largest pool here. And with these two large woody features, which are again concentrating that flow into the pool, ensuring that it remains clean. And again, we've felled several of these large dead ash trees into the river, creating this marginal area, fantastic for fry habitat. Again, you've got lots of space in there that they're really going to be able to utilise. And that's what this reach looked like a year after completion. Really delighted to see it growing up beautifully and greening up. Again, the theme emerging. We've got these very straight sections of river with homogeneous flat beds. You can't really see, but again, this is quite a silty bed. Again, you can see that the estate has kind of started to try and do some work, but was never quite going to be enough in this case. And the reason that this particular reach of river is the way it is this. This is a set of hatches. Anyone who's spent any time on the chalk streams will be familiar. There's sets of hatches all over the place. Again, they're, you know, for various uses of man, basically, where people require the water to be held up, whether it's to divert it into water meadows back in the day, or these days there's a few weirs and hatches that ensure that water is at a sufficient level to feed fish farms. There's, or you know, as we saw with the weir example that we looked at, so there are weirs that are there for mills, but they really do inhibit flow, and anywhere where you inhibit flow in that way, you are homogenizing everything that's upstream of it. So we took the weir out. We're now looking back upstream at where the weir was. What we decided to do here was to actually maintain the pool that had been created by the weir, or the water rushing over the hatches through the years that dug this deep hole. And you know, sometimes you might feel that it's best to fill that in with gravel, maybe try and create some riffle habitat. But on this occasion, we decided that maintaining that pool for larger adult fish to utilise would be really beneficial to the reach. And again, we used large logs, woody features, either side of the river, again, concentrating that flow through the pool to ensure that it doesn't silt up over time. And what about that stretch just upstream of there? So again, putting some sinuosity into the river was important. And again, we've used one of these woody berms. So there's a mixture of wood that we've used in here, some willow that will go on to grow up and provide that overhead cover. And again, trapping the silt, enabling those marginal plants to really colonize that area. And on this bank, you can just see the corner of one here. But again, where access is required, a lot of the reaches of the river we work on are managed by the estates for fishing. And part of that is often that they require that access to the river is maintained. Where you put big trees into the river, or where you put woody berms into the river, you will be generally limiting access to the river for fishermen. And whilst it is often it's a constraint on what we do, it's important that we work with estates to take them on that journey towards river habitat. By maintaining access to the river, we're allowing people to enjoy it in a lot of ways. And when people enjoy being by the river, you know, they're far more receptive to what we do. And in reality, if we can't maintain access to the river, a lot of this work doesn't happen. So whilst, you know, in an ideal world, we might work far more with just lopping trees into the river, there's, you know, got to be practical solutions that enable people to utilize it as well. So let's have a look at what this looks like now. Lovely. So you can really see here this willow starting to create some of these areas of low overhead cover that we know are so valuable. You can just about see where the weir was just down here. And also beyond the willow within the woody berm, you can also see a variety now of marginal plants growing. And on this near side, we've also got a lush marginal fringe growing up. Again, fantastic to see. Within the river, we can see we've now got clean areas of gravel alongside weed growth. Unfortunately, you can see the blanket weed on here, which is endemic just about everywhere. But again, we've gone from a channel which is like this, with very little in the way of habitat features, to one that's full of them. So this is an example where we really were constrained by the location. You know, by this point, you know exactly what I'm going to say. We've got a very straight channel. This is another one where doing I did the topo surveys on this before we put the design together, and along here you're standing in 6 inches of silt. There's actually a mill structure upstream here, and in an ideal world you might pull the mill structure out, but for various reasons that's not practical, not least that the landowner up here has zero interest in doing it, and maybe I don't blame him. However, what can we do in this space? We're very constrained by the fact that we can't remove this brick wall because it's retaining these lovely people's garden. They weren't keen to grade the entire bank down. So what can we do here? This really lends itself to a slightly more engineered solution. So you can see that we're applying the same principles, but in a slightly different way. Here we are still putting that meander in, but what we've used here is rows of posts that are holding back Hessian matting, and a lot of the woody material that was cut down from these trees, which I should have mentioned in the first one, were dramatically overshading this piece of river, so it had virtually zero weed growth in there. They were placed into here. That was then they're used as a bulk material essentially. Again, these people were happy to have a pond dug in their adjacent field. So a lot of this then material came from there. In addition to that, we actually scooped a lot of the silt that was in here and placed that into the berms as material as well. This was then planted with plant plugs. We didn't have, wherever we can, we like to just translocate plants that are already naturally on site. Here we used a selection of native marginal plants to get things started. There it is. Again, I think this was about a month ago when I went back to have a look. And this is one we're really delighted to see grow up so lush and green, having seen it so brown before. And you can see, despite taking out quite a few of those large trees, you've actually still got a decent amount of shade on the river throughout different times of the day, different lots of sun on the river. It's difficult to see, but you've now got quite reasonable weed growth up through, especially through this part here. And there was a lovely shoal of grayling just sitting down here when I was there as well. So it's lovely to see this one coming back so well. So this is the one where people may recognise, and it's a public site. So I think we can say this one's Chilbolton Common on the River Test. You can go and visit this one should you like to. We didn't get the drone before we started this one, so we've gone to Google Maps for the before photo. The first thing that everyone probably notices is the amount of people. It's a really public site, and nothing against people spending time by the river, but one of the effects is, from people and dogs, and also the cows that graze this field coming in and out of the river, have meant that it's over the years got considerably wider than it used to be. You can see the kind of remnants of what would be meanders running through here, and it runs further down here. The project continued right down to the bottom of the common, but we'll focus on this a little bit. So what was the solution here? And there's also quite a lot of constraints on what we can and can't do here. So it's actually quite rare in that the river bed is a triple SI, both as part of the common and part of the river test, which knocked out any idea of, like we did on that previous example, digging the new shape of the river. So we were limited to purely what we could do with woody material. As you'll notice, there is very close to zero woody material available for us to use. So on this occasion, we had to bring in brushwood faggots, which we used. We actually broke them down into their constituent parts rather than using them as faggots. And we placed these into the river channel to accentuate what was there from the old meander sequence, to narrow down the river and accentuate these meanders that had previously been there. And you can see really nicely on this shot how the silt is collecting in the margins. We transposed a load of plants from elsewhere on the common into the berms, and I think this is the shot the next spring. This summer it looks like this. So you can really see those plants taking hold, and you can really see also the change in the amount of weed that we've got in the river, and the fact that this is ranunculus. I should probably mention before that, like, when it comes to the chalk streams, the plant species that's the most beneficial, that we really want to see, that indicates we're kind of getting things right, is ranunculus. Super valuable habitat for huge amount of invertebrates especially. And you can, like I say, you can see how well this is starting to grow up, and we look forward to seeing it continue to do so. Here's another stretch that essentially is an old mill stream, but on a large scale. And this is another one where, for various practical reasons, getting rid of the impoundment at the bottom is not going to be a possibility. However, that doesn't mean that we can't make this considerably better. And again, this is one of those ones where you look at it and there is actually some good stuff going on here. We've got some marginal areas with trees in them that are going to provide lots of cover for fry. We've got some overhead cover. Weed growth isn't bad in this stretch, but there's lots of areas of this where you can see how much tree cover there is, and actually it's not getting a lot of sunlight, which is really limiting growth. So this is another one where we had to think a bit cleverly about what we're doing. And one of my manager's favorite phrases is, "What would a storm do?" And that was the mantra that I kind of took into this project. And we decided a storm would do something like this. Now, this is probably on the extreme end of what we do. And this is an area where we were able to be as messy as we like from a practical point of view. There's no need for people or fishermen or anyone else to access the river. So we just chopped lots of trees in. But we didn't chop them in just willy-nilly. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment, but you can see that we've pinched the channel right down, so we've increased the velocity of water coming through here. That's cleaning off the gravels. You can see that you get lots of interesting flow through the trees here, where there's areas that the water can flow freely through that are creating these great fry holding habitats. There's sediment collecting closer to the bank that will eventually vegetate up. And if we have a look at the next one, this is what it looked like this summer. Again, this is a project from last winter, so we're still expecting plenty more to change here. And what's really interesting about this, I've got a video to finish on to show you the whole little stretch of what we did. But the variation in depth that you've now got through, this was almost all about knee deep as you walked through it before. But where it's going over and under and around all these trees, you're now walking on a much more varied, much more diverse riverbed, where you've got loose gravels kicked up that are going to be potentially good for spawning, areas of riffle where you've got deeper pools that adult fish will use, and obviously you've got lots of cover as well. So we laid in lots of hedges at the top too. This is all hawthorn that will regrow. And then as you come down through here, we put in this large ash on the side here. And that's got a hole under it now that's almost as deep as up to the top of my waders. But then it comes up lovely and shallow here, back to boot level. There's me faffing around at the bottom, making some adjustments. And then larger habitat features that are really woody features that are really pinching the flow and pushing it through here. So it's a very short stretch. We're actually returning this winter to do the rest of it here, down to the bottom. And you can just get a peek at what we'll be working on next winter.